I wanted to say welcome everyone to part two of navigating the art world after graduation with Courtney Childress. Just for your reference, I'll put some of our links and stuff into the chat. For those of you who don't know, this is hosted by the Patty Disney Center for Life and Work at CalArts, and our center is dedicated to helping you as artists professionally develop in your time at CalArts and then after your time as well. So we offer one-on-one advising, different workshops like this, coursework, and in general can just be a sounding board for you as you navigate stepping into the working creative economy after your time in your art program or your degree program. So I'll put some of our links and everything in the chat, but I'm really eager and excited to spend as much time as we have here today over here with Courtney. So welcome again for part two, Courtney. Thank you for being here, and I will hand it over to you.
Awesome. Well, I'm so happy to be here with you guys again. Some familiar names in the group, and then other new people, which is excellent too. So if you missed the first part, we covered a lot of the front-facing part of the navigating the art world in part one last week. And Bailey told me at the beginning of this that they recorded the first part, and they're recording this, and then they're going to put it together and share it with everybody. So if you did miss the first part, you'll have access to this. I went over a ton of stuff, but it was all sort of like about putting your best foot forward, how you present yourself in the art world. And today we're going to focus more on sort of the logistics and details that aren't as readily available, and I guess, a little less intuitive. We're going to talk a little bit about consignment and contracts today. Tax things that you should know going into filing taxes as an artist. We're going to go over pricing, which is a really tricky thing that I know even artists like well into their career still struggle with. So I'm going to try and break that down for you as simply as possible, but I highly encourage you to ask questions. Please don't be shy in that department or any department, like any of these topics, because inevitably a question that you have is going to be something that somebody else is going to want to know about, or maybe has the same question. And pricing is really personal, but I'm going to give you a list of criteria that help you determine how to price your work. And we can go into details about your work specifically if necessary. I'm happy to do that. So whereas last time I talked almost the full 2 hours, today I'm going to try and be succinct, so there's lots of time for questions. And as I'm saying things, if there are terms you don't understand, feel free to drop them in the chat, raise your hand, whatever you want to do, because I'm sure other people have the same questions. So a little bit about me. I've been in the New York art world for about 11 years now. I was the director of a couple of galleries, well-known galleries, and have launched a lot of emerging artist careers and placed them in museum institutions and had really prominent, amazing press written about their work. And now I owned a gallery for a couple of years, and now I actually run Ursula von Riddensfjord Studio. She's an amazing major sculptor that has work all over the US and in Europe as well. And but I'm also an artist. I feel like it's like the suit salesman that's like, I'm also a client. So I know what you're going through, and I understand your point of view to a certain degree, because I'm there with you and also making work and trying to show and get myself out there. And so I want to help you be the best advocate for yourself that you can be. And that's really my role in doing these workshops and trying to, explain the opaque sides of the art world that aren't as readily understandable or shared. So let's see, I'm gonna get started if my computer will stop freezing up. Okay. I'm gonna share my screen. This. Okay. Here we go. Okay. So let's start at the beginning. I'm going to talk about taxes first because they're the least interesting, but also kind of one of the most important things that you will need to know as an artist moving forward. So as you leave school, a lot of you will work freelance jobs. I've done it. I've actually been a freelancer on and off for 11 years post school. And that means I've been an art handler, I've worked at galleries, I've been a nanny, I've waited tables, I've done all these things. And most of them are going to consider you a private contractor and give you a W-4 form. This is, I'm sorry if any of this is redundant information. I know a lot of MFAs are actually like, you know, coming back to this as a second, you know, later in life. And if you, if any of this is unnecessary information, apologize, but it's good to know anyway, for those of you that are new to it. Anyway, so if you are given a W-4 form, this means you're a private contractor and they will not take taxes out of your pay. And that means approximately 30% of whatever you make as a W-4 like private contractor from a 1099, you'll owe to the IRS at the end of the year. And to help offset that, it's helpful for you to keep all of your receipts, and you can use these expenses as deductions to claim deductions on your taxes, and this will help offset the amount taken out, the 30% taken out by the IRS. Oh, come on, there we go. So I'm going to go over all the things that you can write off as an artist. There's more than just what's listed here, but this is kind of the big stuff for most artists. Research, which means anytime you buy a book or a magazine, or you have a TV subscription service, or buy a ticket to a museum, or pay for a workshop, or go to the movies, this is research because it technically informs your work to some degree. I mean, it probably doesn't, this isn't like completely catch-all, like doesn't cover everything, but for a good portion of the things as artists that we buy and collect and order off the internet are used towards our practice or education. So anything that informs your practice is technically research and can be written off in your as a Schedule C on your taxes. Also materials, this is a big one. So if you buy glue or paint or nails or photographs off of eBay or a million balloons or football helmets, I mean, I'm literally I made a list of things that I bought myself as an artist and written off on my taxes because I have a really weird practice, sculptural practice, and I buy a ton of stuff. Stretchers, which is way more normal, canvas, Vaseline, coffee, flowers, thousands of crayons. Those, amongst many other things, can be written off as materials or supplies on your Schedule C. Tools are a big one. So if you buy like a really expensive router or, you know, Festool or something that's like an an expense that you will be using towards your art making, you should write that off as a tool. And if you get into this with an accountant, these expenses over $1,000 that are something that you use over time, they're technically an asset and they'll depreciate over time. So that goes in a different department, but it's good if you're like, I bought myself a $7,000 Mac computer with a ton of RAM and da 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 da. That's an asset and it should be written off slowly over time in your taxes. Anyway, so that's tools. Advertising, marketing. This is business cards, posters for exhibitions. If you make zines for something, you should include the making copies at Kinko's or what have you. MailChimp or anything, any sort of like email blast service that you use. This is advertising and marketing. Fees for your website, the $10 a month that I pay for, now it's like $13 a month that I pay for Squarespace, is technically advertising and marketing for my career as an artist. So you should be writing all of this off. It's really important. Okay, rent. So this may be different state by state, but I think it's oh, hi, Bailey's dog. It's so cute.
Hi, sorry, he has a cone on and he was scratching at himself. Anyway.
So cute.
He'll participate in the workshop now.
I love a dog break. That's great.
Thank you.
So for rent is really important. Most of you are going to have studio spaces that you rent out, even if it's like you're renting your mom's garage or something like that to make work in. You should, oh yes, Benjamin, I'm going to share my presentation with Bailey to share with you guys. So you should be able to, you don't have to, I mean, you can scribble down what I've said because I feel like sometimes that helps me remember stuff, but we will share that. Okay, rent, back to rent. So even if you rent your mom's garage, like, and you are actually paying her a fee, you can write that off. She just has to write you a receipt. You have to keep track of all of that. If you rent an editing suite because you're a video maker, or you rent practice space because you're a musician, this is all studio rent and should be written off on your taxes. I go on to say this has to be a separate space from your living area. I think that the rules for this might have changed because of COVID. Honestly, I think there's been a little shift in this in the last year because of everybody having to work from home. The rules might be totally different next year, but I know for a fact that it has to be dedicated workspace. It can't be like my bedroom, I'm using a corner of my bedroom as a studio. It has to be like dedicated specific space. And there have actually been like, the IRS has taken people to court for this because they claimed their, studio apartment, and they were like, you don't actually have a separate space. You're using your kitchen table. So if you eat on it, it can't be your art space, or according to the IRS. If that's how you're doing it, you should just do it that way. You just can't claim it, unfortunately. Okay, office supplies. This is like staples and paper and software for your computer, and I don't know, I'm looking around to my office right now and I'm like, what do I buy? Tape, like things like that. Anything that's like you would buy at Staples for yourself as an office supply. Shipping is a big one for a lot of artists. And we're going to talk a little bit more about shipping and who pays for it and whatnot. But if you mail something for a show, or mail a piece to a collector and they don't reimburse you for it, that is your expense and you should write it off on your taxes. These are just like the big main ones. There's other things like I know uniform is one that I think a lot of artists try and write off, and it definitely depends on your accountant or how much you can justify this. But if you need steel-toed boots for making your work, you should be able to write them off as uniform. That's the category. I'm not doing air quotes because I'm like uniform. I'm like, that's the category you should put it in. If you have to wear a hazmat suit because what you're working with is really bad, and if it gets on your skin, it'll burn you, or if you have to wear a respirator, these are all things that could be considered outfit or like studio wardrobe. So think about this as you're like making work. Like if you buy a jumpsuit that's specifically for studio art making, write it off. Okay.
I have a question.
Sure.
I don't know how big of a thing this is in the rest of the country. I know this wasn't a thing in Colorado where I'm from, but in LA, they have live work zoning.
Mhm.
And I was wondering how that would fall into writing off your studio space.
That is definitely the case here too in New York. You can have a live workspace, and then it becomes a percentage, and that changes. Last I looked at it, it was. I think it depends. Depends on how you can justify it. Like if you live in a tiny part of your space and you use the majority of it for studio space, then that percentage is like just based on space. You have to like take your square footage and figure out what dollar per square foot is, and then say, you know, my kitchen and bedroom take up this much space and the rest is studio, then that's what you claim. You can't claim it all because it's a live work, but you can claim some. And you just have to be really careful about that percentage, because they'll like make you prove it. I've never experienced this personally, knock on wood, but I have a live workspace, and I have one room in my home that's dedicated just to studio work. It's its own room. It has two doors. I live in a railroad apartment, so it has a door on either side. But actually, he rolled out some weird tax stuff in his second year in office or third year in office. And so the last couple of years, I haven't been able to claim that. So it's good to check and talk to an accountant about this. I should have prefaced all of this by saying, like, I am not a CPA. I don't have a training in this. But I was a bookkeeper. I was a bookkeeper for several years for galleries and artists, and so I do know a lot of the rules, but I'm not a licensed CPA, so I can't really advise you on these things. It's good to ask somebody that knows, especially in California, because it's going to be, the federal rules are specific, and then you might have there might be other state regulations that I am not aware of, because I know New York State really well, but not California. But that's a very good question, Benjamin. Thank you. Or Josh, wait.
It was me. That's okay though.
Okay. Okay. So any other tax questions before I move on to consignment agreement stuff? Also, it can come back around, and if you have thoughts later, feel free to share. Okay. Ooh. Okay, so consignment agreements. Consignment agreements are a really important thing that nobody ever talks about in the art world, except for on the dealer side. And as artists, like this is your only piece of paper that gives you any rights to anything. So I'm going to stress this over and over again. Get a consignment agreement. When you work with a gallery, even if it's a tiny gallery and they're like, not a big deal, get them to write on a piece of paper some of the things that I'm covering here. I'm talking about main points. I feel like everything is going to be, every instance might be slightly different, handled differently. So be sure to ask questions if you have questions, and also ask a gallerist or a dealer questions if you have questions about a contract or a consignment agreement that they're sharing with you, because literally this is your only piece of like legal claim to anything once they have your work. So get a consignment agreement before you hand off any of your precious artwork to anybody. Because I have so many horror stories of artists getting to like really bad trouble because they didn't have a consignment agreement, and galleries like didn't take good care of their work or claims they didn't have their work anymore. So it's really important to have these little pieces of paper that says like, hey, you have my stuff. You agreed on this day to give it back. Okay, nail-to-nail insurance. This is not something everybody is going to have. A lot of spaces, especially if you're working with like a DIY, like artist-run space, they probably don't have insurance. But if you are working with a major gallery or even like a minor gallery with a brick and mortar space, like a real brick and mortar space, they should have insurance that covers your work nail to nail. And nail to nail means, it's really literal, your work is covered from the nail on the wall in your studio to the nail on the wall in the gallery, everything in between. So if they have a shipper come in and pick it up, or if they have our transport come and pick it up, it's covered in transport between your space and theirs. And that most galleries, when they cover your insurance, when they cover your work or insure your work, means if it's damaged or destroyed, they will replace the insured value of it. It's not necessarily the retail price. If it's a photograph, it's usually the production costs associated with that piece, or if it's a reproducible work, that will be what they pay you back for. If it's a painting, they will give you 50% of the retail cost of your piece if your work is destroyed or something happens to it. Usually what happens, if there is an insurance claim, if something gets damaged, you don't get to have the piece back. They actually have to like saw it in half or cut it up into a bunch of pieces for their insurance and take photos of it so they can then claim it, put in an insurance claim. So that's insurance. That's a brief. There's so much more to insurance, but you know, we have to cover a lot. And so I'm going to just touch on these things. And if you need more details, or you're like, hey, I make land art, how is that going to work? Something like that, ask me and I will talk you through it. Okay, usually with a gallery, it's a 50-50 split, meaning the gallery will take 50% of the sale of the retail price of your piece. I know I know several online platforms that are doing a slightly different split, which is nice. They're doing like a 60-40 split or 70-30 split, which I'm like, that makes sense, because the reason a gallery gets to take 50% of the retail cost, and believe me, I've been asked this so many times in my career, like, why does a gallery get 50%? Well, first of all, they have overhead. I know as studio artists, you have overhead too, but they have to usually have employees, insurance, keep the lights on, storage, art transportation, photography, and if they're doing a good job, they should be working for you. They should be trying to sell the work. They should be introducing your work to collectors and to curators that you wouldn't have come across on your own. They sit there for, you know, however many hours a day and talk to anybody that walks in the door about you and what you're making, even if it's a group show. So that's why they get to take 50% of your work, of the retail value of your work. That's 50-50 split. Okay, production costs. This is really important. The questions that come up normally are, who's paying? Do you get reimbursed? And that's going to be on a case-by-case basis. Most of what I understand, or I've experienced in my time, is that the artist pays production costs on their own work, unless it's exorbitant. Like, unless somebody is making like $100,000 film, like video piece, and then we try as a gallerist to like fundraise or get a little money together to help with the production. And then that changes the whole way things get parsed out. But usually it's a gallery, or usually it's the artist paying for production. And then what happens is you get reimbursed if the piece sells. You don't typically get reimbursed if you don't sell the work, because then, you know, the gallery is out the money. And if you sell it 10 years from now, you've been paid twice. You will have been paid twice for production. It gets a little messy. So typically production costs are only paid out after the work has been sold, or when the work has been sold. And then it's really important so then before you get your money from the gallery, they give you your production costs back and then split the remainder 50-50. So just to do little simple math, if your piece is worth $1,000 retail, the production cost is, let's say, $125. That means you get back $125. So $1,000 minus 125 is $875 divided by 2. You get $125 plus $437.50, which is half of the remaining retail value. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Now, framing is one of the things that this is actually involved in too. So a lot of times I know that the galleries will pay framing costs for an artist to have their work framed, because it helps them sell the work. They're more likely to sell a framed drawing or something that's got that contained bit of wood and plastic or glass on it to a collector. So they will front that money in order to help encourage collectors to buy. So if that's the case, then a lot of times galleries will say, like, your piece is $1,000. plus $250 for framing. They'll either lay it out like that in a checklist, or they will just make the total price of the piece $12.50. So that way, when the price is paid, when the retail value is paid, they get their $250 back for framing, and then you split the remaining balance of $1,000 50/50. So just, it's really important that you have all of this in writing, that there's no surprises. Because I have seen too many artists end up like, well, they said that they would pay for this, and then the artist would get upset because they think they're getting cheated. But really what happened is the gallery fronted some cost and they didn't actually want to pay it, have that taken out of their cut, but it was agreed upon. And so I would just say, like, make sure you have all of this in writing. Even if it's not in a consignment agreement, don't agree to these things. If you have a conversation over the phone with somebody, make sure you then follow up with an email and say, hey, just so I'm crystal clear on this, like, these are the terms that we laid out on our call. Because if something goes wrong, it's your word against theirs. And I'm guessing they probably have better lawyers than you do. So get it all in writing, make sure it's all laid out really clearly. Just protect yourself, because you're the only, I mean, as I said at the very beginning, like, I want to make people their own best advocate. And this is a way to do that. Cover your butt, like, make sure you know what's happening with your work and all the details within it. I have just a little example. I worked with an artist that ended up showing at a gallery. I was doing independent curating with this artist, and he was wonderful. And he ended up showing at a gallery, and they paid for all of the production, or all of the framing costs up front. And they said, if we don't sell anything, we can recoup our costs by you giving us a piece. That ended up working out much better in the gallerist's favor than the artist's favor, because his work was worth more. One piece was worth more than all of the framing costs. So just make sure that if you strike a deal like that, because you're like, well, I don't have the money to front for a framed work, that you don't get upset at the end when they take a piece, because that is what you agreed to. But that is a deal that I've seen worked out, and can be a good way to end up with a lot of framed work. Say the work doesn't sell. In this case, like, they sold some of his work, but not all of it. So they took a piece that recouped their cost, and then he ended up with a couple of framed works, which is great, because then that's paid for. And if he sells them out of his studio, or shows them again and they sell, that's, that cost is taken care of by somebody else. So that worked out in his favor, but he got a little upset about it, and I had to talk him through all the numbers to really show him that in the end it was a pretty fair shake on his part. Okay, so something really important that I'm going to talk about more in inventory, I'm going to talk about inventory management a little bit, but when a gallery sells your work, you as an artist have the right to know the owner's name and the city and state that they live in. That's it. That's all you get. You don't get contact information. They don't owe you anything else. That's it. But these are very important details that you should fight for. As somebody who works for an almost 80-year-old artist, we have so many pieces that we just have a name and a city and state. For somebody, the last name and a city and state, it's like so and so in Bern, Switzerland. And I'm like, cool, that's it. But at least I have that. And so when those pieces come back around, I'm like, oh, strange. That work that Ursula gave to somebody in Bern, Switzerland in the 70s has just emerged at auction. And now I know where it came from, because I have the city and state and name of the person. Gallerists aren't going to want to give you that information because they are really protective of collectors and actually don't want artists going directly to them because that cuts them out, that cuts the middleman out. And but you have that right to know where your work goes. So chase that information. Even if they don't want to give it to you, you have that right to know, follow it, because you're going to want to know where your work is. That's true for work you give away or work you sell to individual people out of your studio too. Keep track of all of those names. I will cover that again momentarily. Okay, and then shipping. Shipping is really important too. Shipping, who's paying? Who is paying is always the question I feel like you should be asking yourself when you get invited to do some great show in New York and you're based in LA and they're like, Benjamin, I want one of your pieces. Can you be in this group show? And you're like, oh my God, yes, I would love to be in your group show. Who's paying for shipping? Likely, if it's a group show, you're going to pay at least one way for shipping, maybe even two, depending on how cheap the gallery is, or how, I shouldn't say cheap. I should say like how frugal the gallery is or how low budget, how much money they're trying to save, etc., what their budget is for a show. So it's important to find that out because if you're shipping both ways, that's kind of a bummer. Likely you're shipping one way and that means they're going to want you to ship the work to them. And that I figured out very swiftly after starting to work in a gallery is that is helpful to the gallery because then if they sell the work, they don't have to pay to ship it back to you. So it's an incentive for them to sell the work. They're like, oh, they get the work to New York. I get your work to New York. And I'm like, I don't want to have to pay the $150 to ship it back to Benjamin. So I'm going to try and sell it to somebody in New York. That's a critical differentiation between who's paying which direction. That said, the thing that I didn't write in here and is an important thing that I just thought of as we were talking about shipping is consignment dates. You're going to want to make sure that's really clear too. So when shipping something to a group show, you want to make sure that you know what the dates they want your work for are laid out clearly in this contract. Because if they're like, the show is a 6-week, so typically a show runs for 6 weeks. Some spaces do 5, some spaces do 4, some spaces do 2 months. Like it depends on how much turnover they do in a year and like how long they keep a show up, right? But that said, typically if I'm shipping your work across the country, I'm going to want a longer than 6-week consignment. I'm going to want your work for 3 months because that gives me a little more time to sell it. A lot of sales don't happen during a show and gallerists want the time after the show closes to follow up and sell the work. Aside from like really major blockbuster shows, like I would say majority of sales happen after the show closes. And that's for a few reasons. One, collectors are weird and slow. to, you know, they want to see like if other work sold in the show, if there was any press, et cetera, and sort of, you know, see what happened with the show itself. So I would say a lot of times consignment terms are like 3 months for a group exhibition. If I'm doing a solo show with somebody, I'm going to usually try and consign their work for 6 weeks or 6 months to a year. And that's because if I'm doing a solo show with somebody, I want to work with them I'm actually considering representing them or working with them for a long-term basis. So I want to have a lot of time with the work to make sure that I can try and put it in good collectors' hands. And also, you know, again, if I'm doing major shipping costs across the country or, you know, across the ocean, I want to have lots of time to work on that before I have to pay to ship it back. Because I can't tell you how many times I've like shipped work back to an artist and then like 2 days later, a collector has been like, hey, so that painting that you offered to me 7 months ago, you still have it? And I'm like, oh no, it's on a boat back to Europe or whatever. So upsetting. I can't even tell you. But usually that means like I make the collector then pay for the return shipping, you know. Anyway, so there's all these little details. And like I said, and I'm just going to reiterate it because this is really the most important thing, one of the most important things is like getting everything in writing. Every detail that they say to you, get it in writing. Just get it in writing. Because I'm serious, like this is your only like recourse if something bad happens. Like I've had artists have like a gallery holds their work and not give it back to them for years, and I've had an artist that the gallery knew that their star was blowing up, and they had a show there before I started working, as I was starting to work with them. And the gallery that did their first solo show kept all the work and said they sold it, and then gave them their cut, but kept all the work so then they could flip it later when it was worth more. So that's another important part of why I say to find out the owner's names and cities and states, because they can lie to you about that, but it's a good way to make sure that you know that the work is actually like where they say it is, sort of situation. In this artist's case, he didn't follow up on that, and so the gallery just kept it all and flipped it later, and it was awful. Okay, get it all in writing. Even if you talk to them on the phone, make sure that an email is exchanged, because that's your only record, unless you've audio tape your phone calls, which is that would be weird. Okay.
Courtney, I have a couple, this is Benjamin.
Hi.
Hi, I have a few questions. First off, what right do we have to see invoices from buyers to make sure that galleries are in fact selling a piece for what they're selling it for?
Well, you can ask for an invoice. They're not likely to give it to you because that would have information, that would have more contact information than you're legally allowed to have. What you can do is get them to give you a sales report, which is pretty, I would do for my artists at the end of a show, is say like, I sold 10 of Todd Bienvenu's paintings during his solo show. And I would make a report out of QuickBooks, which is really easy to do. Most galleries can generate it pretty easily, and say like, this piece sold this much of a discount. Oh, that's another thing we should talk about in consignment agreements. This much of a discount, these terms. So like, that's an important thing too. Like some galleries are like, well, I have this collector that wants the work, but only wants to pay half now and half later. You know, and that means you're probably not going to see your money until they see all the money, you know? But I doubt that anybody would show you an invoice. I think it's good to ask for sales reports, but I doubt you're going to get an invoice from them. That's one of those things that you just have to trust that they're going to be honest with you about what they're selling the work for. And again, I think this is one of those situations where it's like, know who you're getting into bed with. Like, it's important to trust the people that you hand your artwork to. And if you don't trust them, if you don't trust them enough that you need to see an invoice to see how much they're actually charging for your work, then maybe don't do that show. That would be my advice.
This, I guess, will be answered later, but it's my understanding that typically with the pricing of works that you do that in conjunction with the gallery. So at least at the front end, you'll have like an idea of what the price should be, right?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. I feel like it's not great to rely on a gallery to determine your prices fully, because they don't have your best interest at heart. You do. But even very good reputable galleries, like they're going to charge what they think they can charge. You know, it's not what the work is actually worth, which we're going to talk about like piece by piece what that means. And so, but I think it is a conversation that you should definitely have, and a very transparent one when you work with somebody, is to say like, my prices are XYZ. And they're like, that seems way too low. And then get them to get them to explain why they think that. Because if they have a better reason, then, well, you know, we sell to a lot of designers and we totally can sell the work for twice that much. That is not a good enough reason to double your prices. So yeah, it should definitely be a dialogue with the gallery, but you should have your price point in mind before you go into those kinds of conversations.
So this also relates back to another question I had about production costs.
Oh, sure.
I mean, that can be very hard to determine.
Yeah, totally.
And how often are production costs reimbursed? Or is it fairly common to just say, you give me 50%, you keep 50%? Because, you know, production costs, like with a painting, for instance, you know,
paintings are tricky. Paintings are one of those production costs that, like, as a painter, you're never going to see a dime for production.
Well, that's what I wanted to know, because it's very, I think it's harder to determine maybe for a painting than it would be for a sculpture.
Totally. So like, let's talk about like Carol Beauvais' like recent metal works that she's got at the Met right now. She made these insane, oh my God, they're so beautiful. I think they're actually fabricated in New York, or sorry, in LA. A friend of mine worked for Complete Sculptor, which is the metal fabricators that work with her. Amazing, like these like beautiful folded metal pieces, and they're all cast or extruded. I can't remember exactly the process, but with that, it's very easy to determine the production costs, because you outsource these pieces, they're made by somebody else, you get an invoice that says XYZ was paid to Complete Sculptor to fabricate and then powder coat these sculptures, right? Same is true with photography. Like, you paid to have this printed and mounted and framed, XYZ costs on an invoice, you can hand it to the gallery. Painting, unless you're buying really expensive stretchers, which most painters I know make their own and do most of that hard labor on their own because we can't afford it, yet we can't afford it yet. but anyway, so it's, if your sweat labor is the production cost, then it's not something a gallery is going to reimburse you for.
But you are getting custom built like stretchers and canvases made. You could potentially use that though, right?
Yeah, but that's something that you just have to lay out in initial conversations. Say like, I have these aluminum stretchers made to this specific parameter. They're stretched for me. I have an invoice from the company that does that. It's really more about just it's more about, if you outsource these things, you can then hand them a receipt. Because I think it's part of why I started with taxes today, is because you have all these costs associated with stuff like things, and those are your expenses. So if a gallery is going to take an expense from you and pay it themselves, they need a piece of paper that says it's worth this much. And then it's easier for them to calculate what they are giving back to you. One of my very good friends was making her own stretchers, not very well. She had a gallery pick her up and they were like, oh my God, we have to do something different. These are terrible. They're warping, but your paintings are great. So they set her up, paid for the canvas, or paid for stretchers for her, and that money is coming out of her cut, So anyway, yeah.
And just last question about shipping.
Yeah.
So if you make a sale to a collector out of your studio,
Yeah.
or what happens, I think very often now, out of Instagram.
Yes.
They're not based in your home city.
Mhm.
So you need to ship it to them.
Yep.
And you have to ship it to them, let's say across the country.
Mhm.
And let's say you're shipping a 4-foot by 6-foot painting. So it's not something you can easily get a quote on either.
Yeah.
Do you just basically say, do you just take on the risk and say, you'll pay, like, I'm going to charge you $2,000 for the painting and I'm going to pay for shipping whatever it costs? Or do you say, you pay me $2,000 for the painting and I'll pay for shipping up to $500? Or what's the best way to sort of deal with this type of shipping situation?
In that case, I would give them a few options. I would say the painting is $2,000. I would give them 3 options. This is like, you can unstretch and roll that painting and say, hey, can you find somebody on your end that can restretch this? Because that would change the cost of shipping significantly and might end up being a lot. If we're talking about a 4x6 $2,000 painting, it's going to cost more to ship it than it is than the painting itself. I know you're probably just using that as an example, but you have to think about the shipping costs and how much it's going to actually be to get it there. You can say well, I'll unroll it, I'll unstretch it and roll it and ship it to you if you have somebody on the other end that can restretch it, because that's a great option. UPS gives a cost prior to ship based on, Uline. Also MasterPack. I've sent a million things in MasterPack boxes. They're spendy, but they're worth every penny because they have foam lining and puncture guard and all this other stuff. And they're so easy. You just open the box and tear out foam in the right size and drop them into this foam lined box with a plastic puncture guard on top. They're spendy, but worth it, because then you can FedEx it or UPS it and it's pretty safe. That said, if you do commercial shipping and not fine art shipping, put the max insurance value on that thing and send it second day or overnight if you can. Because if you give them too long with it, that's when it gets, if it goes ground, that's when it gets dangerous, because you're like, oh, it's been out there a week and who knows how many hands it's been thrown from. It's like one guy is like, throws it over his shoulder.
Can I just mention this happened to me?
Sure.
And I tried
Yeah.
to ship it through FedEx and they said
Uh-huh.
that was too big. So they said I had to go through a freight shipper.
Yeah, that's freight shipping is an option. Freight shipping is an option, but it's one of those that it's a little trickier. But yeah, I wouldn't ever take on those costs yourself.
So basically, I mean, but how do you, if it's an unknown cost and a,
Mhm.
buyer, I think might be pretty reluctant to agree unless they have, I guess you have to maybe get the cost and then tell them what the cost is. And then,
Yeah, I would say, the painting itself is worth 2,000, or the piece itself is worth X amount of dollars. Where are you located? I can look into some shipping options for you. And then you get back to them with a couple of different options. Can I put y'all on hold for just a second? Sorry about that. Okay, so
thank you for answering my questions. I don't mean to derail the conversation.
no, Benjamin, those were all super excellent questions that everybody's going to bump up against. And it's really good you brought all of that stuff up, because it's inevitable that these things will happen to others.
But it just sounds like it's best to have the buyer pay for shipping and trying to determine that before
Yep.
the sale is consummated, basically.
And a lot of times, actually, I've found that, collectors have their own FedEx accounts and like these things set up maybe through businesses or corporations. And they're like, oh yeah, set up shipping. Like if you box it, here's my FedEx number. And then you just write their number on the FedEx slip and then it gets charged directly to them. And then you don't have to pay for it. And then they end up just getting to have it go through their business or what have you. So I feel like just being as open and conversational about that as possible, because you never know what the circumstances are. Or they could be like, oh, that's way too much. Like, let's see if there's another, way to get it to me. Like my cousin's driving across country or something and can bring it, like there's lots of different options. So I feel like if you open up that discussion, like most people aren't going to assume that you are paying for that.
Okay.
Okay. I feel like that, okay, that was really good. Thank you for your awesome questions. Oh, why is it not moving on to the next slide? Okay, well, now we're going to talk about inventory management. And I'm just going to fly through this kind of briefly because I think it's a really important thing, or not because it's important, because there's a lot of information here and you can unpack it on your own time with your stuff on a different day. Yes, that is also true, Josh. People who collect this stuff usually have a ballpark idea of how much they'll be paying for that. I think something that big does surprise people because they're like, why would it cost that much money? But, that's part of why you buy large works from emerging artists, because the price point is lower and then maybe you take a little bit more of a hit on shipping, but then you have this amazing large piece. Okay, inventory management. There are really important things that you need to keep track of with your work. I'm going to share a few different options for companies that do this for you, but these are the things that you need to keep track of for your own work. You might be like, well, I only make 3 pieces a year, so I'm going to remember this stuff. When you're 80, you are not going to remember this stuff. Believe me, you're not going to remember you made this thing in 2020. I mean, that said, I think we're all going to remember exactly what we did for all of 2020 because it was a real weird year. But things to write down and keep track of about all of your work. And this will also help you with the consignment agreements and pricing and all that stuff, is keeping track of all of these details. So title of your piece, media, medium. I try and keep this as consistent as possible. So for instance, if you make drawings on paper, you're going to want to say graphite on paper or charcoal on paper. Or if you're real fancy and want to keep track of the kind of paper, do it, keep track of it, but always try and keep the same details, like as much detail as possible. The date you made it. I know some artists that keep the actual full date. Great. If you can't always do that, fine, but it's better just to keep a year or a month and a year, and then you know pretty much when it happened. Dimensions, these are tricky. You should always just write these down as you're making the piece, because it's hard to remember how big something was later. Give it an inventory number. This is going to help you when you're organizing things later in life. And for the future me's out there that have to deal with your stuff, inventory numbers, write them down, because that way I'm like, oh, that thing that you made that is from 1972 and never got a title and is called Untitled, and you have 70 pieces that are untitled from that year. I want an inventory number because then I actually know which one is which. Signature. This is if you signed the piece, right where you signed it. So on the front, on the back, on the left, on the right, in the center, on the stretcher bar, da 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 da, et cetera, et cetera. This helps this can potentially help authenticate a piece way later in time. It's like, well, that isn't where Ursula normally signed to work on paper, so we don't think it's hers. That sort of thing. I mean, after you're gone and your work is still floating out there in the world, which we hope, that's the hope, and that's why we're doing all of this work, is that it exists well past ourselves. Write down these little details. Edition information. So if you make multiple pieces, make multiples of a piece, write down which edition you've made. If you don't want to produce an entire edition all at once, you gotta write down which one you have already produced, right? So it's like, I've only made 1 of 5 and 2 of 5, but 3 of 5, 4 of 5, and 5 of 5 haven't been produced or haven't been sold or whatever. Write down some notes about the piece. This can be like, I made, if the title is in another language, it can be the what's the word I'm looking for? It can be the translation. Thank you, Courtney. I'm like having it's late in the afternoon. The translation of whatever the title means, or I made this while tripping on mushrooms, or, you know, whatever. I think it's important to keep these details because the future researchers of your work are gonna like fall all over themselves about it. My best friend is the head archivist at the Noguchi Museum, and she like sends me these little tidbits all the time that are so funny. Like, you know, like Noguchi hated this piece and he wrote a note like, I hate this piece. Like, and it's like in his handwriting and it's so funny. And I don't know, it's good to keep little notes like that. if you work in a bunch of different media, like you make sculpture and works on paper and paintings, and then you do performance, it's helpful to have categories so they're easier to sort. Price, which is really important. Any sort of financials, which I mean like production costs and anything that's been paid. So like if you paid for framing 5 years ago and it's just been sitting there, when a gallery comes calling and wants to show the work, you have record of what you paid for the framing 5 years ago. Location. This is the most important part of inventory management, is where did it go? Where is it? I mean, like, is it in your mom's basement? Is it in the flat file? Is it like if it's sold to somebody, where it went? And then exhibitions, which is technically what we call provenance. These last two things, location and exhibitions, are the provenance of your work, which is a super important thing to keep track of. Where did it go? Where did it show? Because that matters to collectors when they're buying the work, which I'm going to start talking about prices in a minute, because oh man, we're going to run out of time. Because that pricing takes a minute to talk through. But anyway, so location and exhibitions are your provenance and two of the most important parts of inventory management. Feel free to ask questions. I don't want to deter anybody from asking questions. That was just I've got to keep myself on time. Otherwise, I'm not going to leave any room for y'all to ask me things. Okay, inventory management systems. These are just a handful of the things that I have used personally and know about and are good options. And I'm gonna not talk a ton about all of these because you can look into them yourselves, but I will say Artbase is amazing, but super expensive. It is the most expensive system out there. They have had the monopoly on the market forever and ever. If you can afford that, more power to you, but I don't, you must be made of money if you can. If you can, buy it, get Artbase, it's great. ArtCloud is less good, but works and is cheaper. Artwork Archive is the cheapest option here, and it's really good, especially for people starting out. It's a great way to keep track of all of these things. They have nice options for like putting together PDF or, you know, keeping track of like, they have nice images. It's a nice interface. I would say like it's great for starting out. And I think it's like $5 or $6 a month, maybe. So if you can afford Netflix, you can afford Art System or Artwork Archive and get it, because it will be invaluable to you in the future. Primer is awesome. It's sort of the middle of the road as far as price is concerned, but it does everything Artbase does for like a fraction of the cost, and it's really good. It's like super well done because it was made by a couple of gallerists that had been frustrated with Artbase for years, which we all are, blah, blah, blah. But it's a really good option. It's just a little more spendy. If you are a photographer or have any sort of experience with photography, you probably have experienced Lightroom. I used Lightroom for a really long time as my database because it holds previews of images. It's a great way of sorting through images and inventory in order to like put together a website or a PDF. And you can put all of your details in the metadata. So it'd be like Courtney Childress, Untitled, 2014, crayon on canvas, 72 by 64 inches. And then I would put like sold, or I'd put the price of it, or I'd put sold and who it went to. what exhibitions it was in, etc. So Lightroom is a really great option. FileMaker Pro is basically the software that all of this, almost every single one of these things is developed from. Artbase, Primer, I think Artwork Archive are all FileMaker Pro skins. Basically, it's just like telling the program what to do and what to look at and how to use this field, etc. So if you're real computer savvy and can work it out, FileMaker Pro is the Artbase. It is Artbase. It is Primer, but you just have to do all the work to make it work right. Inventory. Go ahead.
Sorry. Is there a good reason not to just like use Excel?
Excel is a great option. That's kind of why I went over the thing. That's why I went through the all the categories first, because Excel is a great option starting out. I would say, it's hard to then make a checklist out of it or a PDF out of it. And that's why all of these are worthwhile, because even Artwork Archive, that's pretty inexpensive. You can generate, like say a collector's interest in your work or a gallery's interest in your work, you can make a nice professional looking PDF out of that system quickly without having to like make it in Acrobat or Word, which, then you have to do every single time you do this, so I would say that's the benefit to having one of these actual management systems. And then a lot of these also have contact sections, which are super great because once you sell a piece, you can attach the contact to the piece. And so you can see what people have. And, it's helpful on that end. I'm not sure all of them do, but I know Artbase does, ArtCloud does, and Primer all do have contact options, like Rolodex, like a Rolodex, basically. And that can just help you in general, like, who was interested in this piece? Like my next show, I'm gonna make sure I write them because they were interested in that painting that was already sold or whatever. So you can totally Excel. You can totally do Excel. That's a great option. Just all I say is like try and make categories for all of those categories, because even if you don't have all of those yet, you will eventually, and it's good to be in the habit of keeping up with all of that stuff.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna talk about pricing now. Okay, so criteria for pricing. The best place to start is what you've sold artwork for previously. That has to be where you start, unless you're starting from the very beginning and you've never sold anything you've made before. That might be the case, which we'll talk a little bit. We can talk about that if people have that, if that's the case for them. But previous pricing. If you've sold a piece for $250, that's where you should start your price point, is the previous sale, right? And then from there, you move on to, or, Benjamin, for instance, like selling work on Instagram, like if you sold a piece for $2,000, that's where you're going to start your price point. Then I'm going to look, if I was sitting down and talking one-on-one with somebody pricing, this is how I would go through and figure out how I would price their work. I would look at their CV, look at the exhibition history, awards and recognitions, and see what where they are in the art world. And this is not a judgment. I mean, it's not like a negative judgment. It's just making determinations based on where you've been and what you've done so far. So say you've been in a really cool group show at a artist run space that, you know, is pretty well known. That's actually criteria to help price your work a little higher. And as these things come up, as you're awarded, if you've been awarded by, you know, say you got a prize from CalArts for, you know, merit in your work or something along those lines, that would actually bump up your price point a little bit because a major institution has recognized you as somebody whose work has merit. And so all of these little things are like incremental bumps to make your work priced higher and higher. The next one is a little trickier. So it's like existing collections and collectors. So say your work was purchased by Beth DeWoody, who's a major collector in the art scene, who buys a lot of emerging artists. She buys a lot at a low price point. And when you are if you've been bought by Beth DeWoody, that means something good. It means she saw something in your work and believes in you. And so therefore she's gonna, therefore like your price point can be incrementally higher based on her being in her collection. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about what Benjamin and I were kind of trying to hash out a couple minutes ago. But usually how artists like to price their work is completely backwards from how it actually is priced. I've put these first few criteria in place based on how you should be pricing. Like, these are not in an arbitrary order. It should be what you sold your work for before, your exhibition history and awards, existing collections. And then after that, you talk about materials, labor and production costs, as far as how you price your work. I mean, if we think about like Jay DeFeo's The Rose, that insanely monumental piece that she spent, I can't even remember, like years and years of her life producing. Just because she spent years and years of her life producing it and so much money on materials does not mean it's worth more. Unfortunately, that is not how it works in the art world. Your sweat and labor and materials don't make a piece of art worth more. It's the first three criteria listed that make your work worth more. Basically, I like to explain it this way. Like, if you go around and you're like, well, I spent this much money on material and it takes this long to make it, you're basically building a house with no foundation. You're like, look at it, it's beautiful, it's worth $100,000 because it cost me $80,000 to make. But because there's no structure underneath, no collector is going to look at that and be like, oh yeah, that's worth $100,000, because then they're going to look at your CV or talk to the gallerist that's showing your work and be like, have I heard of this person? Why is their work worth that much money? Because it shouldn't be. You have to build up slowly over time in order for your work to actually be worth something significant. It means, if you've had a solo show in a cool gallery in downtown LA and it got written about and several sales happened, then you can make some sort of not monumental increases, but more major increases to your price point. Until then, you really have to keep it low in order to make sure the right emerging collectors will buy it, and it fits where you are in your career. Otherwise, nobody's gonna even look twice at it. So a couple of other things, like commissions are slightly different. So if you have somebody that's interested in your work and they're like, I love this piece, but can I have one in blue? You can charge them a little more than your regular price point because they're getting you to make a custom thing. And I would say that customization makes it so you are able to charge more than your normal retail price point. And discounts. This is not something we talked about in the consignment agreement section, but this is something you also need to make sure you lay out really clearly with the gallery is discounts. What you're willing to agree to in a discount situation. Collectors want discounts. It used to be that somebody had to follow your program and buy many of your artists and be really engaged with you and what you were selling before you would offer them a discount. Now every collector expects a 20% discount. So most gallerists and artists go ahead and put in an extra 20% before that even happens. So that way, you're kind of breaking even. But yeah, everybody expects a discount. And some of these major collectors that buy emerging artists want bigger discounts, which is insane. So and some institutions as well. I've sold work, not personally, but I've sold an artist's work to the Whitney. They expect a 30% discount, which is insane to me. But it's true for a lot of collecting institutions. They want a discount to acquire the work. And it's worthwhile for you to give them that discount because then if they own your work is worth more. And so you can recoup that discount in the price of in the cost or in your next or in the next sales of your work. I would say, if you're starting out at a $500 to $1,000 price point, when you start to have these bits of recognition, like a lot of sales or great exhibitions, you're only going to want to bump up your prices slightly. You're never going to want to double your price. That's why I mentioned this when Benjamin asked about it earlier. We talked about having this conversation with the gallery when they were interested in your work. This is why I want you to have a sense of what your work is worth before you walk into these conversations, because a gallery might say, oh, well, we sell to a lot of architects and they'll pay twice that much for this. So we should increase the price. I know it's hard to say no to something like that. They're like, we can sell it for double, but say they sell a few pieces of yours for double what you think it's worth, and then you're done working with them, you move on to the next gallery and they're like, wait, why are your prices $2,500 for a tiny painting? You haven't had that many shows, or your record doesn't fit that price point. That's like what I said about not having the foundation for it. So you really have to be your best advocate for this in this instance and say, based on my exhibition history or sales record, I haven't sold a ton of work, so I want to keep my price point low and build up gradually. So it makes sense, in the future, what my work is actually worth. All that said, If you have a Jay DeFeo situation and you've made this amazing monumental piece that has taken you your whole lifetime to make, you can also say it's not for sale. You cannot sell it if you want to hold on to it, or you feel like what your price point at this moment doesn't reflect what the work is going to be worth in the future. Hold on to it. Wait until the Whitney comes calling, and then you can sell it to them. Okay, let's see.
Can you really quickly, just speak
Yeah.
to like starting out prices? Yeah, as like a artist who hasn't sold much, if at all, how would you begin to think about that?
So I would begin to think about how many pieces you make a year, what sort of the scale of those works are. Are you just graduating? Can we talk about you specifically?
Yeah, we can. Actually, I've only sold one painting. It's the painting we talked about.
Okay, and it's a 4x6. It's a 4x6 foot. 4x6 foot painting. Okay.
Yeah, and it was from my MFA thesis show.
Okay.
And so I'm just graduating. And
Great.
I met with a couple people when I got offered, when someone offered to buy a piece. I met with a few people to get some like insight on like how I would begin. And basically they said what you said. They said your work is worth zero right now because you haven't sold anything.
Yeah.
And then they sort of gave me a price range about what they thought it might be worth. And that price range was actually pretty big. And I ended up pricing it at the bottom of that range.
I think you made the right move. Okay, $2,000 is probably a little cheap, a little inexpensive for the scale. A 4x6 painting, you might have undervalued yourself a little bit, but that's okay because that's your first sale. It's better. Okay, so the analogy I always like to use is you can always add more salt to your food, but you can't take it away once it's in there, right? So if you had said like sold that piece for $5,000 instead of $2,000, that means the next piece you sell at that scale has to be $5,000, right? You can't go backwards. You can't go backwards on your prices once they've sold. So say you're like, oh, well, I didn't sell anything. So then you can go back and like readjust your prices a little bit. But once you've sold something, that's your price point. So $2,000 is your starting out price, right? I would say based on you being fresh out of school and the scale of the piece, I would say somewhere in the realm of like 2,500 to 3,000 would have been maybe a little closer to what I would have sold it for, just because you don't want it to be too inexpensive, because then you're devaluing, and collectors are like, wait, why is it so cheap? There must be something wrong. You said you sold it from Instagram? Somebody bought it from Instagram, or is that just you were interested in?
It wasn't sold from Instagram.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Somebody saw your MFA thesis show and was interested. That's great. But that's a great place to start. So $2,000, you've sold a piece. Now, the next time you sell a 4x6 painting, you can charge $2,500 for it. So I would say like based on that first sale, now adding a $500 bump to your price tag makes sense because you've sold a work. That's not going to be the case for every single sale. Every time you sell a piece, you're not going to add a $500 price, like add $500 to the price, right? But because you kind of undervalued yourself a little bit, now we're like, okay, let's tweak it up a little bit, right? I've had an instance where I had an artist that I worked with, and her work, I was selling her work for like $2,500, and we had a solo show of her work up, and another gallery from DC, I think, was also showing her work at a fair, at an art fair, and they bumped her prices up without talking to her, and were selling the work for like $1,000 more. They sold a piece of hers, and then to a collector that then came to New York and saw my show and saw my price list, and they went to the artist and they were like, "You owe us $1,000." So that's why I say it's really important just to like keep your prices consistent and also make sure you're growing slowly. So I would say like you're in a good place. Like, you know, at this point you want the work in people's hands. So you want to price it accordingly. Like, it's not doing you any good in your studio sitting there or in storage that you have to pay exorbitant prices for. I guess y'all are in LA, so maybe it's a little cheaper, but still don't pay $1 million for storage. Like, sell the work if you can. Get it into people's homes, because then also you can charge a little bit more for the next ones.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, slow and steady. Slow and steady is the name of the pricing game. It's literally the thing to remember when you're doing all of this. Don't buy into the pressure from outside sources to sell the work for more. You've got to be firm about what your work is worth, and it will serve you in the future. It might feel silly and you're like, why am I not taking these people's more money? Why am I not taking the more money? I promise you, it will be worth it in the long run. If I could like come visit from, I'm visiting you from the future, of your future self. Say like slow and steady with all of this stuff. Why is it going backwards now? Okay, so that is the end of my PowerPoint, but I see people who click this stuff. Oh, that's from the shipping conversation. Okay, ask me all your questions. Oh, Yuka.
Hi.
Hi.
Courtney. Thank you for your presentation. I had a question for as a filmmaker.
Yeah.
Because it was really fascinating to hear your presentation with like, I'm assuming 2D artworks or 3D artworks, but for moving images, do you know any resources of like how to what the options are? I guess it's very hard to know like how to make money. Yeah.
Do you make, are you a filmmaker? Or are you a fine art? Is it fine art like video?
Filmmaker, yeah, and I freelance, and I have like my own prices accordingly to the project. But yeah, I guess like for films, like specifically, like there's distribution and like ways of kind of attaching yourself to maybe a production studio. Or I mean, I don't think galleries really do that. Do you have any insight? Yeah.
No, they don't. Galleries don't typically deal with film. I mean, video work is something I can talk about, but it's going to be slightly different than what you are doing. Because with video work, there's editions and artist proofs and a special set of collectors and things to consider when selling video work. But yeah, there's no like distribution or production houses or anything that there's not the equivalent in the art world. It's different. But I will say, like, as far as filmmaking is concerned, like institutional support is probably going to be an avenue that you should consider, like trying to get your work shown at institutions and museums and schools and things like that. That may be a good way to get sort of your work out there on a more like grassroots level. So Ursula, my boss had a documentary made about her. A filmmaker sought her out. Actually, he did a small piece about a specific work of hers, and then he was like, "I want to do. She's so interesting. I want to do a full length documentary about her." And it took him 3 years of like shopping it around, like getting MoMA to screen. Like we had to call in a bunch of like art favors and like get MoMA to screen it and like yada yada yada, like get it into some places and then and get it into film festival, get it into a couple of smaller film festivals, and then it got picked up by a distributor. So I think it's just like you're doing the same thing that an artist does until they have representation by a gallery. Is like you have to do all the legwork yourself, you know. And you're probably not going to make very much money off of your work until somebody else picks it up and runs with it. But I'm sorry I don't have more info about the film world, but I will talk a little bit about video video and editions, because I think that's something that does apply to the fine art world and is something that should be considered. Editions in general, if you're a photographer, anybody that makes multiples of something, edition information is something to keep in mind when pricing too, because if you have a small edition, say you've made an edition of 5 video pieces, that means that each one of those editions is going to be worth more than if you made an edition of 50. So an edition of 500 is less, you know. That means like if you made an edition of 500 of a sculpture, like you can charge $25 for each one, you know, but if there's 50 of them, you can maybe charge $250, or, you know, if there's 5 of them, you can then charge $2,500. So it's like it depends on how many there are. The scarcity, like the market plays into this and scarcity plays into this. So the fewer there are, the more they're worth. And something to keep in mind also about editioning work is that you should always keep an artist proof, an AP, when making work multiples, because that way you have something to sell to MoMA or the Whitney or LACMA when your star rises. That's a good thing to keep in your estate or sell to a major collector or institution later. Something also you can do with editions, which is it's not talked about a ton, but is a pretty common practice, is to do a stepped edition. So that means like the first one is worth less than the last one you sell. So if there's an edition of 5, the first edition is worth $100. The 5th edition, based on demand and where the piece has been shown, where the other editions of the piece has been shown or purchased, is then could be worth, you know, $5,000. But it's graded depending on where you are in your career at the point of the sale. So that's something to keep in mind.
Thank you.
With edition. Yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't be more helpful. Is there anything else I can say about film?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, or if there are any other like resources that you know of.
You know, I would maybe look at, this is kind of a research move from the gallery end of things. Like if you want to look at their like distribution houses and see, like most of them have websites, and you can see what film festivals they get their artists into. Like that may be a good research tool for you to figure out like where these distribution houses are looking at films, like which ones they're actually going to and looking at.
Mhm.
Because I think film festivals, like, you can apply as anybody can apply. You know, there's different categories and things. There's many options for that.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. Working backwards. Yeah, I'll try.
Yeah, work backwards. Like, and I will say the same is true for like for artwork. If you are totally clueless and you don't know how to price your work, you're like, I don't even know where to start. I've never sold anything. Like, where do I start? Go on Artsy. Artsy is a great tool. Their work is priced where you can see it. There's so many more online options for looking at prices now, that you can then see kind of what's comparable, like where you are comparably to somebody else. You're like, I make paintings on canvas. I make enamel paintings on canvas, and you can search like enamel paintings on canvas and find somebody who's in a similar like age range, exhibition range as you, and see what their price point is and start from there. It's a really good tool to use to your advantage. So in the same way that you can look at these distribution houses or production spots and see what they're applying to or what they're getting into, it might help figure out some working backwards. Let other people do the research for you. Great. Or help you with your research. Okay, we have a few more minutes. So what other, I know you have other questions. Don't be shy.
This is probably similar to art, film, and video, which I also do a little bit of, but most of a large portion of my practice is digital works, and specifically I do a lot of sound that winds up as like MP3s, WAV files. And yeah, in the event that someone would want to buy that, how does all of this work in terms of things like that?
I would edition it just like a video or a photograph. And the way you would then potentially sell it would be if somebody say somebody buys it, and this would be true for a photo or a video or a sound piece or a performance even. Sold all of those things in my life. Is they would get, the collector would then get like a hard drive with the file on it and a certificate of authenticity saying, this piece was made by so-and-so on this date in this state. And usually I would include an image and like contact information at the bottom if it's directly from you, and then signed by you. And it would be like, this is edition 2 of 10 of this work. And then, you know, with collectors, we did a lot of things. Like artists would make like custom boxes for the hard drive or something cool to go along with it. Or, you know, with an audio file, you can also send them, you know, a download. Like you can send them a link to download it and say like, here's your piece, but also I'm sending you this physical thing for your collection as well. You know, I think treat it just like a physical object in a way. Like keep it real and give it some presence. You know, but also I think like we're not stepping into this. NFTs have been around for a few years now, and everybody's just starting to pay attention, which I think is really amazing. I mean, I know a lot of the art world is like NFTs, and I'm like, no, this is exciting, because the thing about it is it like upholds your rights as an artist in a way that galleries don't. Like there's tracing for all of your stuff. So if you sold your audio files as NFTs, like somebody buys it, you know, you then can tack on like a addendum that says like, if you resell it, I get 10% of this, and it's all traceable and trackable, and that's awesome because you can't do that. Well, most people can't really do that with their physical artwork objects. Yeah, but it's all, I would just treat it in the same way that you would a video or a photo.
And then similarly, and this is probably most similar to like a performance, but like installation work.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine that it's usually like, here's the rights to recreate this and some documentation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if it's ephemeral and there's not objects that you can then hand off to somebody that buys a piece, it's the same thing. You would end up giving them a certificate of authenticity and documentation to say, like, you know, and instruct a set of instructions. And those can be as loose as like Yoko Ono's, you know, performances, or they can be as detailed as like Janet Cardiff's like crazy audio installations that fill rooms, you know, like you can get really, you can go, it should match the work, and that's all I'm saying. So I would say, yeah, for anything along those lines, you're gonna wanna just have all of that laid out really clearly for somebody to buy, you know? But it is possible to sell installations and video and audio. I've done it, like there are collectors out there for it. You just have to be really smart about how you present that information and keep documentation and video and all that stuff, which isn't necessarily the performance that you would then sell, but it helps sell the work, you know?
I have one more related question, but I'll let Benjamin go next because I think he had one.
Go ahead, Josh.
Okay, thank you. So, and then like with digital work and editions, future copies, well, I guess this applies to certain physical work too. Like, how does that work if you decide to expand an edition in the future?
Okay. You don't expand an edition. Once an edition is set and sold, you've sold one, you can't add anymore. Actually, you can, but you have to then go to the collector and say, I need to make more of these. And that basically means their work is worth less. So they're probably not going to be too happy about that. So you have to make that set from the beginning, I would say. It's really important to keep to that. It's the same way that you wouldn't like drop your prices. You're not going to change the edition number because it will change the value of the thing. So you have to make it. That's why I said APs. Make an AP. Make 2 APs. If you're worried about that, make 2 APs, and those aren't for sale to just like anybody. Like you wouldn't sell one of those to me as like just an average collector. You'd sell that to an important collection, like Beth DeWitty, or like you know, the Whitney or MoMA, or you know, even like a smaller institution. Like that's where those go. Those are your like safety backups in case you sell the rest, and then you're like, oh crap, what do I do? I've sold everything to random people, which is great, but now like the MoMA's calling and I don't have any more of them. So that's why you keep a couple of copies that are for you.
Do you have to declare those to other collectors?
Yep, you should say. It should say the way that it's written out is one would be like this: 1 of 5 to AP. That's how it should be written in your when you're keeping your inventory management or your Excel spreadsheet. So then it would be 2 of 5 to AP. And then when you get to the APs, it would be addition of 5, AP1 of 2. Just like that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
So Courtney, you said something really funny that I just wanted, I mean, it was sort of an offhand thing you said that I thought was curious, was you said most artists can't like get a portion of the resale on an item of a physical work, unlike maybe an NFT, but I imagine there are some like painters, for example, like maybe a Gerhard Richter or something who can. I don't know, can they? Because I've always been told they can't.
I mean, every dealer in the art world will say we can't, because it's not, I mean, there's actually an artist contract out there that's been floating around. Hans Hake is part of it, and it was made in the 70s. And it is a document that these two like art lawyers put together that have like rights like that listed for artists, and they intended it to make collectors sign it and say, like, if you resell this piece, you have to give the artist a certain percentage of the resale. Like, nobody does it. Nobody can hold anybody to it. And there's been resurgence of it over the years. Like, I just watched this really amazing video of like Hans Hake and a few people talking about this, and he uses it, which, I mean, he's a major institutional artist and his work is also institutional critique. So it's like, he kind of can do that, but I don't know that I would be able to do that with my work and a gallery. The other reason I say you can't is because it would take all of your time and energy keeping track of all of that. Like Adrienne Piper, for instance, I think tried for a little bit to do this, and she was like, I would have to hire a completely separate like admin staff to just track these things down. Because it's like, you'd then have to find the person that bought it and be like, did you sign this contract too? Blah, blah, blah. It's almost impossible to keep up with. But that's why NFTs are so interesting, because it's just like folded in and you can't get away from it because it's already in there, and it's like, you have to give me money for the resale. Germany does have funny laws about living artist resales, as do Paris and Japan, but none of them cross to countries that don't have resale rights. So like if Japan has their own set and they're like, you have to pay an artist resale, blah, blah, blah. But if an artist in Japan sells to the US, it doesn't transfer. So there's actually a law in California about this, but nobody holds it. Nobody holds to it, and it doesn't leave the state. So if you sell to somebody in California, these rules apply. But if you sell to somebody in New York or Kansas or anywhere outside of California, it's not applicable. That was a good question. These are all good questions. Great job, guys. Okay, well, I can probably take one more, or else we can wrap it up. It's up to you guys.
I had a question.
Sure.
If work does sell, when can you, or what would you have to say about when you should expect to be paid?
Okay, that's a tricky one. Oh yeah, if only Ethereum was an environmental nightmare. I know, it's so upsetting how terrible it all is. There are some cryptocurrencies that are trying to work around the terrible environmental garbage that's happening. We could talk for another hour about that. Okay, sorry, your question was, when should you expect payment? So typically in a consignment contract or any agreement you have with a dealer, you are going to get payment within 30 days is what they say. But that implies, that would imply that the dealer was paid within that time frame. So basically, you should get paid when the dealer gets paid. And it should be within 30 days of them receiving payment. And that should be stated in your consignment or contract or email back and forth with somebody. That said, dealers can be shifty about that, but also collectors can take forever to pay. And it's like chasing a cat. If you do it too aggressively, then they're like, they swipe at you or they give up on the sale or whatever, you know, like use expletives and walk away. So really it's one of those things that has to be handled like super delicately. And if somebody's dragging their feet about paying you, it's likely that they haven't been paid for the piece themselves. So I would say like, that's a hard question, but I've had collectors take months to years to pay for something after they've bought it and I've invoiced them. I've had work sit at shippers or at framers spaces for 6 months, taking up space. And the way to get them to sometimes pay is to start charging them storage fees. That's what I've had to do to get people to pay. It's like, I'm going to charge you $25 a month for every week that this sits in my gallery that I can't move it. And then they usually pay because they don't want to pay more money.
What if someone else offers to buy the piece?
Then you go back to that first collector that purchased the piece and say, hey, I have another interested buyer. If I don't hear from you within the next week, I'm going to sell it to them because you have not paid your invoice. That's pretty easy. Like if you have another buyer, I've also made that threat without having another buyer, which is, that's a roll in the dice, but it also is a good way to get people to pay up.
You know, you've talked a lot about consignment agreements and how important they are. And
Yeah.
I was just curious, is there like do you have like a boilerplate consignment agreement that you can like email to us that we can like basically like edit, but like just so we have a sense of where to begin with? Like, or is there one online that we can access? Like, you know,
There's probably one online, but what I will do, give me a couple of days. Let me pull one out of the ether of my storage from gallery days and I'll send it to you just so you have the verbiage. Because it's like reading a different language. It basically says what I laid out for you, but it's not going to be so clear. So yeah, I'll pull one out of my files and then just like send you the language so you have it. Because it's good to see. I mean, until I started working at a gallery, I had no idea what a consignment agreement was supposed to say. And I was working at a gallery as an assistant while I was getting my MFA. And all my friends, as we graduated, they were like, I just got offered this show. And I was like, did you get a consignment agreement? And they're like, what is that? And so I made a habit of reading other people's for them just to make sure it said all the right stuff. But I'll try and find one and send it to Bailey to send to you guys along with the PowerPoint presentation, because it's super helpful just to have, they're all going to be different. They're all going to say slightly different things, but I think the one that I used for my gallery was pretty standard. So I can grab one of those for you guys.
great, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Bailey, what's the best way for us to get this information from you?
Yeah, so I put it in the chat earlier, but can also just put it in again right now. You can just email the Center for Life and Work. So our clw@calarts.edu email. Probably by Thursday, we'll have the recordings and the PowerPoint presentation and any of the handouts that Courtney wants to share as well. And we can just reply to you in that email with it.
Great.
And
thank you.
also in general, we always post, just so you know, we always post our workshops and stuff that are recorded. We post that on our YouTube channel for the Center for Life and Work. It's linked in most of our Career Corner newsletters that goes out to all of the students. But you can also find that on our site too. And always just email us if you want a direct link to anything.
I want to say thank you to all of the awesome question askers. You know, really helped flush this whole workshop out. I could have said all of that, but it's way better for you to ask questions and give me specific examples, and so we can talk about it, because I'm sure everybody else here was curious about the same things or didn't even know to ask those questions. So I so appreciate all of you guys for that. Thank you.
No, thank you, Courtney.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Courtney. It's so nice to have you here. And like I said, everyone, yeah, the email is in the chat if you want to reach out to us for even for other things too, for like advising appointments or portfolio reviews, anything like that over the summer. Don't hesitate to just shoot us an email and we will make sure you get in touch with the right staff member and resource and everything. But again, thank you so much, Courtney, for this two-part talk. I learned a ton as well about consignment deals. I was like, these are definitely things that are, you know, it's not universal and it's not necessarily shared or taught all the time. So getting your perspective is amazing. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing.
Oh, my pleasure. I had a great time, and you're an awesome group of artists to talk to. Good luck with everything.